All right, hello to those entering the Zoom. We'll just get started in a few moments, letting you all filter in for a little bit. All right, hello. My name is Morgan and I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. First, I will drop a link in the chat for where you can purchase the book Misogynoir Transformed: Black Women's Digital Resistance straight from PNP's website. You can ask our speakers a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can towards the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Also, there is an auto captions feature for this event by hitting the live captions button at the bottom of your screen. Let's introduce tonight's guest. Moya Bailey is an associate professor in the School of Communications at Northwestern University. Her work focuses on marginalized groups, use of digital media to promote social justice, and she is interested in how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. She is the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network and the board president of Allied Media Projects, a Detroit-based movement media organization that supports an ever-growing network of activists and organizers. She is the co-author of #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice, and is the author of course, tonight's book. Bailey will be in conversation tonight with Adrienne Marie Brown, the author of Holding Change, the way of emergent strategy, facilitation, and meditation. We Will Not Cancel Us, and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice. Pleasure Activism, the politics of feeling good. Emergent strategy, shaping change, changing worlds, and the co-editor of Octavia's Broad, science fiction from the social justice movements. She is the co-host of How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia's Parables podcast. Let's give our speakers a round of applause.
Hi, Moya Bailey.
Hello, Adrienne Marie Brown. How are you?
I am kind of geeked out to get to be in this moment with you right now. I'm feeling
I
very
have
good.
to say the same. I have to
Yeah,
say the same.
I
I'm so
feel like
excited.
I'm like we made it happen. Um, and and it's like we're in the midst of. I just landed in a new place, and you're heading to a new place, and so it feels like there's something like grounding about getting to stand and fangirl you in the midst of everything else is chaos. But this, there's like,
Absolutely.
and happy Lauren Olamina's birthday to you.
Yes. Happy Lauren Olamina's birthday to you. This is
I'm a
birthday
12-year-old
number
Black hero.
12. Yes.
Yes. This is it. I keep thinking I'm just like, we're almost there.
We're
And for those
almost
of you who
there.
may not know, which I doubt there's anyone, but for anyone who doesn't know, Lauren Olamina is the protagonist of Octavia's Parables, Parable of the Sower, the Parable of the Talents. And that story starts in 2024 with the birthday of this person. So happy Lauren Olamina's birthday. And that kind of offsets that Jeff Bezos went to space. So we have to like reclaim the vastness of all blackness of space and time, right? That's all we have to do tonight. Is just really reclaim space.
Absolutely.
And I just want to, I have a lot of questions as I was reading this book, but before I jump into just like straight asking you all the fan questions, I wanted to just say thank you. Thank you so much for creating this term. And then thank you for writing this book.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
Thank you so much. We were texting earlier and I was saying that I really think this book is such a gift and a surprise. Like I think it will be a surprise to a lot of people because I
Ooh,
think
what
there's a
surprised you?
well, I think the trend now is like if someone coins or articulates or claims something, that then the book that might follow is just like trying to get at that phrase over and over again. And I feel like what you did was like, this is the phrase, this is misogynoir, but here's what it looks like to actually transform all the conditions. And you wrote this book that is hyper visionary and hyper directional. And really, I said it's a Trojan horse for a lot of ideas. And I think that's really exciting. So I think people will come like, oh yeah, misogynoir, like having that term has helped me and here's the text. And then I think they will leave like, oh, I just got reshaped in terms of what I understand to be the importance of this. And it's really thrilling when a book is able to do that. So I just want to say thank you and congratulations on that labor and making that happen. For folks who haven't read the book yet, which I might do, buy it, read it, I want to just read the description, the very first thing, right? What is misogynoir? So we know what the context is here. Misogynoir is a term Moya created in 2008 to describe the anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women experience, particularly in US visual and digital culture. Misogynoir is not simply the racism that Black women encounter, nor is it the misogyny Black women negotiate. Misogynoir describes the uniquely co-constitutive, racialized, and sexist violence that befalls Black women as a result of their simultaneous and interlocking oppression at the intersection of racial and gender marginalization. It's such an epic term. It's such a great term. It's enjoyable to say and to be able to be that precise about it. So the first thing I want to ask you is, how has it felt to, to name something that's so big and precise and then claim the idea and have the book out in the world? How's it feeling?
It feels strange. I prefer generally to be in the background. And so this has pushed me forward in a way that I think has made me a little uncomfortable, but like good growing pains. And not that I don't enjoy people. I am an extrovert, although people don't maybe think that. I do love connecting with people. And I was saying actually to Morgan before we got started that one of the downsides of the pandemic is that all of this is virtual. And so you don't get the interaction with people that usually comes from these events. But also, that is another gift in that it is not so draining. But similarly, it is exciting that people find the word so useful and helpful, but then also a little concerning that the word has to be used so much. So it's a both and, like one, grateful that it has utility, then also frustration that it just seems like it's everywhere because misogynoir is everywhere, unfortunately.
Everywhere. Yeah. And I want to get into the landscaping that you do of this because I feel like it feels like one of those things where like you can feel how you're like, oh, if you want to detract from it or if you want to deny it, like it's like, no, you won't. Like actually it's there too. But before that, I kind of, as I was reading through the book, I was like, kind of jotting my questions down. And so there's an arc to this that follows along the arc that you wrote, because I love how you tell this story. And I wanted to ask you to start first in the lineage of this. And if you could talk a little bit about the impact of Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall and Dr. K, because I love how you weave in like what they did to kind of tend the soil that created this.
Yeah. So I was a little one at Spelman College. And before you even start at Spelman, there's like a first year week that you go through where you learn the history and the traditions and all of the things. And so in this time, Beverly Guy-Sheftall would do a talk on some topic. And she taught us about Sarah Bartman, who was a Khoisan woman from the area that we now understand as South Africa, who was displayed throughout Europe, taken and performed in essentially a human zoo. And we know her story because there was some legal proceedings that made her story more visible, like there's a record for her, but there were countless other women who were taken and then exploited in this way. But this was a story that I had never heard before. And I just couldn't believe, how could I not know that this had happened?
Right.
And also that this Black woman's body was why she was being displayed, that there was something
Right.
about her, the way she looked, that made her so interesting to these Europeans who out her sought her out. And so that really sparked my interest in women's studies and thinking about how Black women are represented, etc. And then taking multiple classes with Dr. Guy Sheftal, and then also with Dr. K, Dr. Kaumba, who's another faculty member at Spelman. And I just got hooked on women's studies and became president of the feminist group on campus. And from that, ended up leading a very small, very earnest protest or action when Nellie was coming to campus to do a bone marrow registration drive. And that got a lot of public attention, but
Yeah.
on campus, it was not the best feeling. But it was, again, this other lesson about how Black women are treated and understood in the world as being useful for somebody else's ends, but not necessarily being valued for their own
Mm-hmm.
being or for just being. And that became a real impetus for how I wanted to understand how Black women are treated in all aspects of society.
Mm-hmm. And then you graduate from Spelman and you're part of the Crunk Feminist Collective, and you're helping kind of shape how everyone is thinking about feminism, modern feminism, and what the battlegrounds are. And so walk us up into this moment in 2008 when you actually are like, this is it.
Yeah. So I'm writing this dissertation because I was pre-med and thought I was going to medical school, and then defected and went to graduate school instead, but still
Mm,
had this real interest in how Black women are treated in medical
mhm,
context. And so wanted to investigate that. And unfortunately, I saw a lot of the representations from this particular moment in the 1910s that mirrored some of the representations that I was seeing in popular culture about Black women in 2008. So, why were these stereotypes of the Jezebel, the mammy, all of these stereotypes still circulating? What had happened in 100 years that hadn't shifted these all that much? And that really became the question, because the representation was so similar.
mm,
And I wanted to name that exact intersection of anti Black racism and misogyny that Black women and people read as Black women experience.
beautiful. I think part of the reason this book feels like a surprise is because I expected it to really be such a history of misogynoir. Like, just like that, it's like, yes, this has been here and we need to teach people. And I expected it to be much more like timeline oriented. And you touch into the historical context just enough to be like, there's receipts. There are receipts historically, like this happened. But then you really land firmly in current political landscape and into a visionary text. And I love how you keep weaving us between what's happening online, what's happening on screen, and then what's happening in real life between us and in space. And you keep showing us how ideas, negative ideas, limiting ideas, narrow ideas, supremacist ideas, how those ideas become beliefs that then guide the actions and interests of everyone, and how we are constantly trying to find our way out. So there's two things that emerged for me early in the book, which one was, what do you think that people keep misunderstanding about misogynoir? Like, do you see it misused or misapplied or stretched?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, one way that it's misunderstood is people want to apply it to all women of color,
Mm-hmm.
which it's very specifically addressing anti
More.
Black. racist misogynoir, yes, anti-Black racist misogyny, and then also that it's about the person who is doing the harm in terms of how misogynoir is operating. So it doesn't matter if you identify as a Black woman, the person who sees you and understands you as a Black woman, they're going to then perpetuate, enact misogynoir in your direction. So it's not necessarily about self-identification. And I think that's important because we've had a real hard time, I think, in this moment, trying to name all of the people we mean when we're trying to gather folks together. You know, and it's women and femmes, non-men, all of the language that we've tried to put on and adapt. And I would say what misogynoir brings is some clarity around who's in the position of power and how they're using that power to amplify a very codified and concretized idea about who Black women are. And your personal identification doesn't matter to them and their desire to do harm.
Yeah, that I feels like the thing that the Uncle Tom folks never understand is I'm like, you don't have to want to be in the club to be in the club. Like you still gonna get treated like you're in the club under pressure.
That's it.
And so that all makes a ton of sense to me. And it's such a tender thing, like I feel like when I see people who want to deny that racism exists, want to deny that misogyny exists, want to deny it, I'm like, you're running away from something that is like, no one wants to have to experience this, but it actually does help to name that it's happening if you ever hope to transcend this thing happening.
Absolutely.
And I feel like you keep inviting people. It's like, come with me so that we can transcend it together. But the other question that emerged to me early on was, have there been people, because I've seen a lot of people use this text, I'm like, what? What you know about misogynoir? Have there been people who you felt like understood and used misogynoir correctly that surprised you?
Ooh. Yes. Like, one, I have to say, not a surprise that she used it correctly, but I really credit Trudy for the word getting out into the world in a big way, because Trudy really pushed it online in ways that it expanded and crossed a lot of communities that I think otherwise would not have used it.
Yeah.
But to see it move in some mainstream spaces has been really interesting. So I guess it was on an episode of the Charmed reboot, which was like that surprised me. That did surprise me. I did not expect the term to move in that direction. And it's one of those things where I hope that with saturation that we are moving towards a place where now that it's named, we're in a better position to do that work of transcending and transforming. So very much drawing on emergent strategy in terms of how we grow into a different relationship with misogynoir.
That's right. Well, so that brings us, we're right at the precipice here, because I want to get into this digital alchemy with you. So I want to read you this quote of yours, which these Black women and Black non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks are carving out their own spaces rather than trying to make room for themselves within existing frameworks. And I feel like that, to me, there's a big nutshell of like, this is what this book is actually about now. It's like, okay, so misogynoir is here, but actually all of our people are engaging this beautiful, what you call digital alchemy, which I just love that way of talking about it, because it is like at the deepest root of shifting, we're shifting, and we're doing it in this digital realm, which is brand new and still to be shaped anyway. And so you start turning us towards what's happening, and you bring attention to what we're creating. You uplift Janet Mock, you uplift so many examples. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to just share what feel like some of those intriguing examples of digital alchemy that you are seeing in motion right now.
Yes. And even some from, I think, before, because some people might have missed Janet Mock's Twitter activism moment, because
Yeah.
clearly Janet is in another phase
A
of her
whole
life.
other realm.
You
Yes.
know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
there was a moment where Janet was really in those Twitter streets and
Yes.
helping people along with the hashtag Girls Like Us. And that
Yes.
hashtag built a lot of community. And one of the really meaningful pieces that came from that hashtag for me was the connection between Jen Richards and Angelica Ross, that they actually met through using the hashtag, became roommates, moved out to LA, and did this wonderful web series, if you haven't seen it, called Her Story, which is so cute. And her story just gave me a different sense of what was possible. And it was one of the first web series to be nominated for an Emmy in a new category, paying attention to digital production. So I just think that there are possibilities in digital space that digital alchemy really speaks to, that there are
Yes.
connections and things that can bloom and grow in that environment. And I'd say particularly even, 5 or 10 years ago, I think we're already seeing that we're in
Yeah.
another digital moment. Things have already shifted
Yeah.
away from the time I was writing about in the book. It seems very
Yeah.
different now.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Well, and one of the things I think was an exciting surprise to me is that the book is really centered on trans women's stories in a major way and the activism of trans women. And it feels like both naming how central they are to misogynoir and where it's happening, and how people's perception of trans women plays directly into these perceptions that people have had of Black women, and the digital resistance. It feels like sisterhood scholarship to me. Like it feels like this loving act of sisterhood, and being like, actually, a book about Black women is going to center in trans stories, Black women's stories. And so I wanted to ask you, when and how did you understand that that was going to be the focus of the stories you were telling within this book?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I mean, because I started with Janet Mock, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's how I got there. And also just that there was something I was seeing in popular culture that was really a moment where Black cis het women and Black trans het women were
Mm-hmm.
being aligned, which is true, but also it felt like queer women, non binary people were somehow outside the conversation, like
Yeah.
not included, when
Yeah.
I felt like we are also here. And
We
also
got issues.
and
Yeah.
we've been holding it down in some ways, in terms of trying to do the work of solidarity. And so
Yeah.
I wanted to tell a different story about where queer women and trans women meet, in
Beautiful.
terms of the organizing and who's really leading our movements and who's got the vision for where we need to be going.
Yeah, I love it, and it shapes the story so beautifully.
Oh,
Like
thanks.
what we're into. I love that what you say here, and again, I think I said this to you earlier, is not just like misogynoir is a complex concept, right? Like it's a layered piece, or it's like you have to actually do some scholarship around misogyny. You have to do some scholarship here, and then understanding all these identity aspects is a really complex thing. And we are, when you talk about this weird digital moment, I think part of what's happened is there's a lot of murky water in terms of what is identity, what is community, um, I saw this beautiful thing going around from Barbara Smith where it's like, we took the identity and dropped the politics. Like there's a lot happening around how identity moves in the digital sphere, and you contend with all the complexity of that. But then you're also like, the ways we are moving through it and the ways we're surviving are equally complex and adaptive. And one of the aspects you talk about is the embodied transformation of misogynoir. And I'd love to ask you to share a couple, point to some of the case studies that feel like this is what embodied misogynoir looks like. Because I mean, embodied transformation of misogynoir looks like,
Yes.
because they're it's so distinct, right? Like you're seeing a
Yes.
pattern that's actually like teaching people how to see the pattern. So
Yes. Well, one of my favorite examples comes from the chapter on Tumblr, and I get to
mhm,
talk to some Tumblr homies, and one of them is Danielle Cole, and they
mhm,
share their own story of being transformed by the radical community that was on Tumblr and having some sense of not really understanding how colorism operated. So growing up in a small town in Massachusetts where all Black people were Black people, there wasn't really, the racism wasn't seemingly making a distinction.
yeah,
But then getting some education from people online saying, actually, colorism is a thing. Here are
yes,
some things that you can read.
yeah,
And being, I would say, called in to a
mm,
conversation that was transformative, and being able to process that and have a different relationship to the conversation because it was understood that this was a community that we want you to be a part of. We want you here. We just need you to come on and get some knowledge on these
yes,
topics. And so it's a different way of engaging. And I did a talk with our friend Miriam Kaba, and one of the
yes,
things Miriam said, which I feel like was so helpful, is that we've moved from a moment of having connections with people to having followers. And the
yeah,
idea of followers definitely changes the kind of interactions that you have with people.
yeah,
There isn't a sense that you are trying to transform or shape a different way of relating to one another,
yeah.
if there's only somebody who's broadcasting a message and we aren't connected.
I really love that distinction. And I feel like so much of what's been happening, it ends up being quite painful, like quite a painful space to try to occupy with each other, even though transformation is still happening within that space and is still necessary within that space. And, um, you know, one of the places we were talking about earlier is like there's this stickiness now where misogynoir lands and rubs up against the culture of call out and call in and accountability. And we see it play out where someone is, something is named about a person that is like, oh, or a question is asked where it's like, that's a legitimate question, like that's something that people might want to understand. We were talking about it related to Patrice colors and Black Lives Matter, where it's like, yeah, we don't have a context of necessarily understanding $90 million in one place. Like we don't
Yes.
have in our movement space, we don't have a context for what that means. We're not regularly talking about the budget of the policing that's happening to us and what the budget might have to be to organize against that, or any of, like, we're not in that realm often. And so these questions come up, right? Where it's like, what's happening there? Legitimate questions, especially for something where it's like, this is a lot of different people with a lot of different directions that they want to move in, not all in agreement about this. How does this happen? And then misogynoir comes and wraps itself all around that until it becomes almost impossible to get at an
The
actual
actual question.
conversation, right?
Absolutely. And so it then, of course, begs the question, how do we create a context where we can still hold the question without covering it and getting it enmeshed in misogynoir so
Yeah,
that people can still get to, again, what you described, legitimate, real questions that they have, but not participating in the very kinds of harm that we are trying to undo. So it definitely becomes a distraction and puts people on the defensive when we should be having a different kind of conversation. And I do think that this has a lot to do with, again, as Miriam described it, the shift from connection and relationship to
Yes.
followers, but also
Yeah.
I'd say this is one of the other people that I interviewed for a podcast that will be accompanying the book in a bit. Was Gorilla Mama Medicine or Maya Williams.
Okay.
And her perspective was that we had moved away from a time where we were pen pals writing back and forth on blogs,
Yes.
that we had an exchange that was occurring, and that exchange is gone. And there's a different sense of who your people are and how you feel connected to them. So my hope is, and something I lay out at the beginning of the book, is that I really want it to be a conversation and an opening so that
Yeah.
more people feel invited and like they can participate. Because there's still, again, an international dimension to this conversation.
Yeah.
My work is focused very much in the US, but there could be an opportunity for us to go and commune with a larger populace who has more to say about misogynoir in their own context. Misogynoir in
Yeah.
Brazil, for example, or misogynoir in the Caribbean.
Well, and I love what you're speaking about in here too, because I think what happens so often is misogynoir gets brought in and makes something personal that should be systemic. Like that is like, we're talking, this is a systemic conversation, right? Like with Danielle, it's like colorism. This is a systemic conversation. It's not a personal one to you. And how do you get harnessed into being able to have that systemic conversation? And one of the things that seems to be happening, the pattern, which I keep saying, I think we really underestimated the internet. You know, like I think as organizers, like if I look back 7-8 years, you know, I feel like everybody's like, y'all need to like digitally secure your situations, and it was like, what? Everyone's showing up with like love for movement, and it was just like, oh, like love for movement, yes, but not sharing a context of the systems that we're actually trying to dismantle, transform. Um, and without that systemic analysis, people are coming into that internet space and getting the language around systems, but using it personally. I keep, you know, I'm like, ooh,
Yes.
right.
And
And I
that
feel
goes
like,
back to Barbara
yes,
Smith's point about identity,
yes,
identity and not the politics. So
yeah,
if we are focusing too much on identity, then we're missing the systems. And of course,
yes,
we know that people make systems, people are part
yes,
of systems. That needs to be addressed. But
yeah,
when we focus on the individual, we're not getting to the actual people who are causing the most harm. So this goes back to, I think, all the things that we've learned from, Insight, Women of Color,
exactly.
all of them who are trying to tell us that we tend to hurt the people who are closest to us because they're the ones we
Yes,
can reach, as opposed to having a strategy for dealing with systemic oppression.
yeah. Um, yeah, I really appreciate that too, because I feel like what you did, which is so brilliant to me, it was just like you went kind of digging in the crates, and you went through and you kind of combed the system, like in a way that, like, I've grown distrustful now when people are like, we're sourcing this from Twitter, we're sourcing, you know, like this is sourced from Twitter, like this person on Twitter said this person on Twitter said that. I'm like, was that meant to be in this context or whatever else? But the way you do it in the book is you're like, there's a story inside of all of this about how that transition has happened. You know, like that it's not accidental. is the story inside of how how we were pulled away from the politic and how we've been pulled into kind of being at each other's necks. And there's a story of how people are doing things differently, like pulling off call outs, pulling off or call ins, pulling off accountability, at least in the pockets of community in which they sit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I want to point to that because I'm like, I think that what you've done is created something that will be a roadmap for how people can do some scholarship around digital alchemy and digital organizing in the future. Because you're like, the story is here if you learn to look at it. But I had a question there about just your process in this. Like, were you just like all along kind of gathering this stuff, or were you going back and being like, what were the hot points that I remember? Or did you ask other, you're like, what are some of the hot points of Twitter organizing you've seen? Like, what was the actual process by
Yeah.
which you gathered all this story?
Such a great question. And I'd say part of it is, like most things in feminism, it's both and. So I would say it was built on relationships. I don't think I could have written this book without having relationships with people that I developed in this time of Twitter, in this time of social media, where we were pen pals writing back and forth before we got to this place where people are followers now. So that helped in making me remember who were the interlocutors or the people I wanted to speak to. And then using some of these digital tools like Voyant and Gephi, which really highlight and help you to discern what are the most frequent conversations, who are the users who are referenced the most, all of
Yeah.
that making it very clear. So it's not just me saying something, but it's
Yes.
what's coming up over and over again
Yeah.
in the data that I have.
That's awesome. I'm like, thank you for digging. Thank you for going in there. And I have like 1 to 2 more questions that I want to ask you. And I want to make sure that people know like this is your space, your event. So please drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we're trying to hold, like 15 minutes so that we can get to people's questions and so that you can speak, directly with Moya and hear direct answers and brilliance. So yeah, ask questions. So I want to move into this place of the radical imagination. And one of the things you quote here is, even as we create the world we want to see, our radical imaginations can still be limited by the world as we know it. So we've kind of been in this territory, but there might be more to add to it. So I wanted to ask you, again, a double layer question here. One is, if you were to kind of map out the landscape for us of like, where do you think are the limitations right now on our radical imaginations?
Yes. So this one is easy because I feel like the limitations, I feel them. One place that I feel them is in the chapter where I talk about the web shows that Black queer women are creating. And there's so much possibility and playfulness and exciting, juicy goodness coming out of those shows. But also, we end up with love triangles. We end up with cheating. We end up with the things that we all know. We end up with toxic masculinity.
Yes.
And I just feel like we can imagine more for ourselves. We can imagine another way of relating. And I actually just saw a BuzzFeed listicle about like tropes that people are tired of. And one of the tropes that people are tired of is, of course, the love triangle, which again, there's so many options besides a love triangle.
Yeah.
There's so many possibilities, but
you could do a love square, baby.
you know,
There's just other things.
just other options.
Yeah.
And one of the shows that I do mention is a show called 195 Lewis, which takes us into the realm of polyamory, which gets
Mm-hmm.
exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, what are our limits and imaginations around poly, where it's two primary partners,
Yeah.
a secondary partner, etc. So just saying
That
that we have,
hierarchy is still
yeah,
centered in
we
it.
have
Mm-hmm.
we have options. We have even more that we can dream up and dream beyond
Mm-hmm.
that could really give us a new way of understanding ourselves and the world that we want.
So that leads into that second part of the question. Because I'm like, okay, so those are the limitations. And then if you imagine us beyond those limitations, like in that transformation and in that um, healed, potentially might be a way of, like that space that has healed from the ideologies that have been causing us such harm. What is your radical imagination for this world beyond misogynoir?
Yes. I think a lot about Danielle's response to this question,
Mm-hmm.
which is in the book. And I asked a similar question of them, which was, what are your ideas about a social media platform
Yeah.
that has transformed, where misogynoir is not there? And she offered an idea of a platform that was dynamic and included the people who are using it and the people creating it working together to
Mm-hmm.
imagine what it looks like, and that it's iterative, that it isn't just one and done, that there are moments where it might build into something else and expand, but that's something that is done in collaboration with the people who are using the
Mm.
platform and not just done by the engineers. And so when I think of, what our world can look like, I'm always thinking about what we can do together. Like when I
Mm.
was talking to Miriam, we both have this interest in uh, high control groups, otherwise known as cults. And I feel like I'm always trying to find the line between cult and commune, cult community.
You're not alone. Like, what is that line? Yes.
Yes. How do we create the communities that are actually nourishing and flourishing? And
Yeah.
and I think part of it is an understanding that what we have as the world exists right now is so big, it's so many people. And
Yeah.
if we can start small, thinking about emergent strategy and fractals,
Yes.
if we can do this at a small level, then we can grow and create more ripples that have that same good foundation that creates the opportunity for
Yeah.
us to be more capacious, more brave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I keep thinking about, Toshi and I are doing the Octavia's parables. And so we've just been deep diving in. And one of the things that struck me again, this read of it, is that Lauren's vision for Earthseed was that the communities would always be at 1,000. And then once it was 1,000, it would splinter and start to form the next community. That was kind of the amount of people that it was like, this is a juicy community. A lot can happen here. All the needs can be met inside of this. And then it can get too much. And if you're too far, if it's too big, we can't actually hold community. We can't hold center of community.
Exactly.
And I'm like, yeah, what would it look like to have a social media that was structured in that way? Because I'm like, and I'm sure you're experiencing this also. It's like you put something out in the world and all of a sudden your platform starts to grow and people are like, you must know things. And it's like people you don't necessarily have, it's like when I started out, I had a relationship with anyone who followed me or anyone who was,
Yes.
it wasn't even follow. It was just like, we
We
know
know
each
each
other.
other.
And here's the
Exactly.
pasta I just made, like that
Yes.
was the internet. And here's how I feel about what just happened on the news or whatever. And it has shifted so much. And I'm like, oh, what would it look like if the cap for everyone, whatever your
Yes.
job was 1,000 people or was, 5,000 people or whatever it was, but it was just like everyone has this cap And what you're saying, if it's going to go beyond that, has to go by word of mouth or by other people kind of spreading it
Yes.
to their,
Yes. And I
something
mean,
like that lines with, you know, I'm like, yes, that thing.
yes. And to the point of how we started this, thinking about Bezos, there's a cap to how much
Exactly.
money one
Ah,
can make
I want
because,
that. Yes,
there's the level of exploitation that capitalism has allowed, I think, has shifted even the way we understand our use of the platforms. This book
absolutely.
doesn't talk about brands, but that is the language that people use now to talk about
Yeah.
their social media presence.
Yeah.
And, when I entered, that wasn't how we understood
No, in
our
fact, I think
use
we
of
look
it.
down on it.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, like still when
yeah,
people they're like, "What's your?" or that's your brain. I'm like, I'm not doing that.
yeah,
Like I post because I have something I want to post or whatever. But
yes,
people do, and I'm also trying to not be you know, like my Virgo judgment. I'm like, don't judge that. Just be present with like this is what's changing all the time.
yes.
It's
But I
always
mean, but I
changing.
think that is a response to a capitalist market that
Exactly.
is exploiting us, right? So if
Yes,
you
all the time.
don't make it a brand, then it'll be used in a BuzzFeed listicle, and
Right.
that writer will make a paycheck, and then what do you have? So like
Yeah.
it's the capitalist imperative that on the one hand I do understand, and like,
Mhm.
yes, your ideas, you deserve to profit from that, and also that has shifted the whole way that we relate to social media.
It has, you know, I have been struck in the past like 5 years by how often people are like sharing an idea and then all of a sudden, like, now pay me. And I'm like, oh, that's fascinating because, like, you know, and I think Miriam has also been talking about this idea of where do we grapple with things. And I heard Asha Bandele talking about this, like where do we grapple with things? And it's just it feels like this thing that keeps emerging where it's like, yeah, how do we wrestle and grapple with these ideas that we're all trying to figure out, right? When
Yes,
because of capitalism, we're all trying to rush to be the expert of an idea that hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, right? Like
exactly.
I'm like there are people who are like, I'm an expert in misogyny. I'm like, but Moya hasn't written the book yet. Like, you know, more like, you know, but I'm like, there's that rush of like, oh, I right. And there's that piece where I'm like, what gets lost in that rush
Absolutely.
to territorialize and monetize the realm of thinking, the realm of creating, the realm of
That's it.
ideas and imagination. And I think we lose so much
Oh,
in
I
that.
so agree.
Mm-hmm.
I so
And
agree.
so I
And
love that what you're, yeah, go ahead.
no, no, no. Well, I mean, I think that's the challenge now when we're thinking
Yeah.
about what happens at this level, what's happening online now. Can we get back to a place where we can grapple with those hard questions?
Yeah.
People have, my friends and I have been joking. It goes down in the DMs in the group chat. Like
It's all about the
that's,
group chat. It's all about the
it's in
DMs.
these private spaces where you
Yeah.
can say those things, but of course that's limited, and those are your friends. It
Yes.
doesn't have the same iterative capacity that we had
Yeah.
in those early days of Blogger, where
That's right.
people were exchanging ideas
That
across
were
a wide
truly
community.
different.
Yeah,
They were truly different. You know, like I had the experience last year of uplifting something. I was like, I disagree with this. I was so excited. Like I was like, this is something I don't agree with, but it was just like, this is such a good idea. But it's like we can't do that now. You can't just be
yeah.
like, you know, it's something else. So we do have some questions that have come in, and I wanna raise one that feels very related to what you just said. So how can Black women, femmes, and gender nonconforming folks protect themselves online? Is a form of protection even possible? And I say that because I'm like, to me, the DMs in the group chat, the smaller circles has been like my mode of protection, but I'm like, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about in the book are maroon sites of respite, like little
Mm-hmm.
places where we gather that other people can't enter. So I'd say there are Facebook groups where I feel like some of this is possible.
Yeah.
There are opportunities on Instagram sometimes where people have created a community that's closed. This is what I used to think about Tumblr and used to love about it, but
Yes.
everybody's left. There's no one
And
on
you're like, I'm by myself. No, yeah, I feel like that. I keep
Yeah,
having that experience where I was like, Friendster was great.
you know,
MySpace was great.
MySpace was
I'm just like,
awesome. Yeah,
but yeah.
yeah. So I
I
do
mean,
think
even
that
that
there,
monopolizing thing where it's just like actually having
yes.
more social media options is beneficial for that
Oh,
protection. Mm,
absolutely, right? Because the only reason I'm still on Facebook is because there are job and, like Facebook
yes.
has thoroughly integrated my life in a way that I don't know if I could do without it and do all the things that I want to do.
That's
And
right.
that is a, little bit of a scary thought when we think about how
Yes.
recent social media is and how
Yeah.
integrated it is in our lives. So, also limiting how much time you spend on the platform, I think, is another really key part of protecting yourself when you can.
I love that you said that. Like I'm at 15 minutes a day right now, and I'm amazed at how much people keep being like, how are you getting stuff done? How did, I was going to ask you that too. Like, how'd you write a book during the pandemic? Like, how do you get stuff done? And it's like, if you redistribute some of the time from social media into writing, reading, doing other things, um, that protects your spirit and your ability to think for yourself, as well as what might become, it helps put that stuff in the right scale. And
Absolutely.
then I also want to add, just like boundaries are okay. And I feel like I'm seeing more and more black femmes and gender non-conforming people come out and be like, here are boundaries for how I move online.
Yes.
And like they're all different. Everybody has these different lines, but there's something powerful. And I think that also brings us into this next question. Do you think internet activism on social will start resulting in more withdrawal of participation from Black people, especially Black women? And I asked this question thinking about the Black TikTok strike.
Yes. I totally think so.
Yeah,
And that means that we're going to have other ways that we need to communicate. And I think some of those mean going back some of our analog methods. I'm in a group of friends and we've been writing letters back and forth to each other, like
oh, romantic.
sending the mail, you know. What does it mean to resort to other ways of communicating that don't involve the digital, especially if we're thinking along these parable lines where who knows how long the network
Exactly.
will be supported? What are our
Yeah,
plans and strategies for when things inevitably get disrupted, which seems
yeah.
very probable in our lifetimes?
Well, and I would argue, I really think it's already disrupted. And
Oh,
I
absolutely.
think we are still trying to understand that. So, like, the number of times, like, I've had this experience. Yeah, I've coached multiple people now through like these internet tension moments, conflict moments. And the number of times where I'm like, a lot of the people are not real people, or a lot of the people are not in movement, or a lot of people, like I'm like, there's a huge amount of disruption, I think, already happening. And it's not a space, none of the spaces are ones that we own yet. And
Yes.
so I'm like, we're in this kind of, I mean, which I think makes what we are able to pull off that much more awesome,
Amazing.
right?
Agreed.
Because I'm just sort of like, what Black Twitter does, how we change the conditions, how Black creators are transforming conversations, policies, like all these things using this technology, which is both undergirded by bots and trolls and from above owned by overlords and capitalists. It's like we're still able to do this. And I think it is the Lauren Olamina strategy to be like, and make sure, I'm constantly thinking like, how do I use this space to build my authenticity, to build my capacity to think for myself, and to build my capacity to be in actual relationships with people, right? To know like, oh, this can be mutual. This can't. Ah, right? Because I'm
Yes.
like, that's the skill we're gonna need when eventually that collapse, you know, it's like eventually, I do think eventually a lot of the social media will just be the trolls and the bots in like
Yes.
hater circles with each other, and we will have, you know, found our way to farms where we're having 1,000-person conversations, you know, and or you know, creating something else where I'm like, right, Octavia also offered us that idea of like, we will figure out telepathy at some point, and then we won't have to have that interlocutor or whatever between us.
Yes.
Then just be like, Moya,
Yes.
what do
But
you think
for
about
us
that?
to get to the telepathy, I think we have to
Mm-hmm.
do so much more work
Yes.
on ourselves and the healing and the
Yes.
like the body work, the
Yes.
I don't know, training our minds, the meditation.
Yes.
We have a lot of unlearning to do for
Yes.
us to get there. And that's going to take real time. So even as we imagine our movement strategies and what
Yes.
we're moving towards, making sure we make time to put in uh, that important work of connection and relationship building
Yeah.
so that we have the tools that we need for the world that's coming.
So I want to ask you that too. Then it's like, outside of the digital realm and your alchemizing and your organizing and your research, what is your Moya Bailey like set of unlearning and relearning and like advancement practices? Like what are some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah. So one thing I will say about the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
I knew before I needed to work on meditation
Mm-hmm.
before, but the pandemic has made it very clearly a
Non-negotiable.
practice. Yes. And I'm doing that, which before
I
seemed
love
so
that.
hard. I'm I'm a Gemini and an extrovert, as I mentioned. So
Oh yes.
sitting still with thoughts is like, I don't even, what? Sitting still and not even thinking thoughts,
Yeah.
that has been very hard. So I have really, as you know, gotten into floating, which I was into before, but that's
Yes.
kind of my main meditation
So
practice right
do you do
now.
that once a week or what?
Once a week.
Wow.
hmm
That's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that.
It's made a difference. It's made a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's something sacred. You know, it's always like there's something in the collective that is so sacred. And then I think there's something about meditation that reminds us we're never apart from the collective.
hmm
Like you don't have to go online to be a part of the collective. It's
Absolutely.
it's
And
always
also
there.
just that repetition is holy. So the
Repetition is
things
holy. Yeah.
that is, wonderful Nikki Finney, Appalachian poet, uh, that the things that you do every day, things that
Yes.
you do, those are the things that you're putting energy into. So trying to make
Yes.
sure that the things that I'm putting energy into are things that are for the world that I want.
There's one last question that just came in, and then we'll be closing out this like sacred space together. While imagining these futures, have you thought about how disability justice plays into the transformation of these digital geographies?
Absolutely.
I
It
was
was
like, I know
actually
you have.
disability justice was really an essential jumping off point for how I thought about digital space and the idea that people were poo-pooing activism online as slacktivism or armchair
Yes.
activism. But I knew and had the experience of being connected to disability justice activists
Mm-hmm.
who had used social media in such a transformative way that they had created connection, created community. And I had the real pleasure to be a part of the Crip Camp summer camp co-convened by the late Stacy Park Milburn and
Mm-hmm.
Andrea Levant. And that space used Zoom platforms to create a real opportunity for people to grapple with not just accessibility, but what disability justice can look like, what it means for disabled people to have community with each other, and how that might foster and foment the kind of world that we want, where disability is always in our future. Uh,
Mm.
that is an integral part of the world that we need to create. That there will always be disabled people, especially when sometimes science fiction wants to write disabled people out of our futures. So
We will not have it. Oh.
we will not have it. And Octavia's Brood is another perfect example of where we won't allow that to happen. So
Yes.
I definitely feel like disability justice is a huge component of creating the new possibility for a new world.
Moya, thank you so much for creating new possibilities for a new world for us. Thank you for making such an incredible map and like spell book for digital alchemy and giving us all these case studies and just the labor that you put into this. I hope everyone buys this book. I hope everyone buys it for friends and buys it for every Black person on the internet and everyone else too. So thank you for giving us your time tonight and spreading the word yourself, like coming and being here. That's also something you don't have to do. So, really grateful to you. And thank you to Politics and Prose, to Morgan for showing up with us tonight, and for y'all for hosting and uplifting this incredible work.
And of course, on the behalf of the store, I'd like to thank you both for being here this evening. We also like to thank our audience for showing up, of course, for another great book talk. We also ask that if you are purchasing Misogynoir Transform, that you are purchasing it from Politics and Prose if you're here tonight. Your support by purchasing books from the bookstore is what helps us keep this events program going. And I wish everyone a great evening.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Yes.
Such a pleasure.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.